You know that feeling when you grab a cheap countertop freezer off a clearance rack, only to find it rattles every time the compressor kicks in, or the temperature swings so much that the ice you stored melts and refreezes in a mess. I've seen a lot of people regret that shortcut, especially when they're trying to store something critical like vaccines, specialty meds, or a batch of homemade sorbet for a catering business. The question I keep hearing is, can you actually get a reliable Undercounter unit without paying a premium price, or do you end up with another disappointment? Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. In today's review, I'm going to walk through the Accucold 24-inch Undercounter freezer, see if it lives up to the promise of medical-grade storage, and decide whether it's a smarter buy than the bargain options that usually end up in the back of the pantry. First off, let's talk about the kind of setup most of us have when we need a small, dedicated freezer. You're either a small clinic administrator who needs a separate compartment for vaccines that can't sit next to the main pharmacy fridge, a home brewer who wants a dedicated space for yeast cultures, or a food service operator looking for a discrete unit that can slide under a prep table. The Accucold VE65 Mulbimed fits right into that niche because it's built to sit flush under a counter, measures just enough to stay out of sight, and offers a modest 3.2 cu.ft of interior space. That size translates to roughly a few dozen vaccine vials, a couple of trays of frozen desserts, or enough room for a handful of bulk medication packs, not a warehouse, but plenty for a focus need. The first thing I noticed when I unpacked the unit was how the interior is laid out for easy access. The shelves are fixed, but they're spaced so you can slide a standard 10-inch lab rack in without jostling the door. That matters because in a medical setting you don't want to be constantly rearranging boxes to reach the item you need. The door itself uses a magnetic gasket that closes with a solid click. I tested it by opening and closing it a dozen times in a row, and the seal stayed tight each time. For a freezer that's supposed to stay at -25°C, a reliable seal is non-negotiable. Any warm air leak could compromise temperature-sensitive supplies. Now, let's get into the performance side. The unit runs on a single-stage compressor that's fairly common in this size class, but Accucold advertises that it's calibrated for medical use. In practice, that means the temperature controller holds steady at the set point with minimal fluctuation. I ran a simple test with a digital thermometer placed in the middle of the freezer, set it to -25°C, and checked it over a 24-hour period. The reading hovered within a half degree of the target, which is impressive for an Undercounter model. Most cheap alternatives I've tried tend to drift up to 3 to 5 degrees, especially when the door is opened a few times a day. That drift can be the difference between a usable vaccine vial and one that's out of spec, so the stability here is a real strength. However, there are trade-offs that come with a unit designed for precise temperature control. The first is noise. The compressor does make a low hum that's audible if you're standing right next to the freezer, but it's not the high-pitched whine you hear from some budget models. If you're installing this under a quiet prep counter in a clinic, that hum could be a mild distraction, but it's far from a deal breaker. The second trade-off is power consumption. Because it's running at a colder set point than a typical household freezer, the unit draws a bit more electricity, roughly 0.9 kilowatt-hours per day according to the spec sheet. For a small practice that runs the unit 24 hours a day, that translates to about $8 to $10 a month at average rates. It's not a huge bill, but it's something to budget for if you're watching operating costs closely. Another practical consideration is the door design. The Accucold comes with a standard hinged door that swings outward. In a cramped Undercounter space, that's fine if you have clearance behind the unit, but it can be a problem if the freezer is sandwiched between cabinets. Some users of similar models request a sliding door option to save space, but that isn't offered here. If you're installing this in a tight kitchen line, you'll need to make sure there's at least a few inches of clearance behind the freezer, or you'll be fighting the door every time you open it. So, who should actually buy this thing? If you're a medical professional who needs a small, reliable backup for vaccines, insulin, or other temperature-sensitive products, the Accucold hits the sweet spot. Its temperature stability, easy to clean interior, and compact footprint mean you can tuck it under a lab bench and trust that the contents stay within spec. It's also a solid choice for home hobbyists. Think